Hi, I'm Meshal Malik, and you're watching Indus Special. Whether we realize it or not, our data is constantly being collected. But what happens when massive data sets, in other words, big data, is collected? How is this information used, and how will big data shape the future? That's our discussion today. Joining us to talk about it is Mr. Einar Tangen, who's a political and economic affairs analyst joining us from Beijing. Also joining us is Mr. Furhan Hussain, who's a digital literacy and protection consultant and co-founder and director of Connect Tech. He joins us from Karachi. Thank you both for joining us and welcome to the show. Mr. Hussain, let me begin with you. Now, for a person who isn't well versed in the tech language, how can we understand big data from being different than any other form of data?
Big data can be classified as very large sets of data in quantities that can only be processed using very high computing power. Now, this could include the medical records of all the people in a city or something like Nadra's database. But having said this data isn't always very high quality because of its sheer size, and humans alone cannot make sense of it without using specialized computer algorithms. Now, on the other hand, everyday pieces of information that we choose to consume for a specific purpose can be considered small data. It's more comprehensible. It can involve some level of curation through human intelligence and nuance. An example of this could be just like a few individuals' health records or financial statements of a business or something like that.
Right. So you're talking about how this data is being collected. You gave us some examples of how data for citizens are collected, for health departments are collected. But it seems like this is going beyond just national borders. Now there's a global fight for big data. Tell us a little about that.
Of course. Well, this has been said so many times, and it sounds like a cliche, but it really is true that in today's era, the modern currency is information, and whoever has more control of that information gets to have an unfair advantage over everyone else. There have been a lot of ethical implications regarding the processing of this data, there are many privacy issues involved with it as well. So what happens is that it concentrates power into the hands of a select few, and then they can use this information to manipulate populations with just a keystroke in a way. We saw this happen in the US, where Facebook's data was used to play a role in swaying the election results against a more popular candidate.
Right. And these are all very essential examples that you're giving us. But before that, I want to, and when we talk about that, we'll talk about that in great depth. But before that, I want to jump to Mr. Einar Tangen and talk to him about this. Mr. Tangen, as we talked, as I mentioned this to Mr. Hussain, that it seems like there's a fight over big data. And of course, as he said, information is key. Now, in this entire fight of trying to gain technological supremacy, how important is this big data for how economies are developing in the modern age?
Well, in big data itself, it has many different permutations. One, you talk about the Cambridge Analytica, where they were able to influence what happened with Brexit. The example given by my colleague about what happened in the United States, how Trump was able to use Cambridge Analytica and the tools that they used to gain power. So that's one part. Then you have the purely commercial part, which is, I know what you like in terms of movies and what you like to buy, and I can use that to suggest things that you might want to buy in the future. Kind of targeting. This is just an ongoing part of advertising. And then this the last way, which is a little more sinister, is I can see into your private life, and I can, in essence, decide whether or not you're a good person. I can put you on lists, people who I think, oh, well, they read such and such a book, and they meet with such and such people, and therefore I think that they're a risk to society. So these are I think the three main areas that people like. It's not only having the information about you, but kind of putting you on lists, the ability to use this as a means of gaining power, and then there's the economic issue of how people use it for advertising. The advertising, I think, is the least of the issues. The other two are more serious.
Right. Mr. Tangen, a lot of people will come up with this question. We talk about all this information, how it's being collected, the sinister forms of it. But in all of this, does the individual really matter? How much is the individual being looked upon? Not just nation states, a collective community, but one individual.
Well, it's not all bad. I mean, individuals are, in this big data, they're just seen as part of sets. And now it could be wonderful. For instance, so many people have bought these Apple Watches, and they can monitor your heartbeat. And they can, in essence, collect a tremendous amount of medical data, which is now available. And it's real time, and it's throughout your life. So when you start putting that together, you might have some medical breakthroughs which will allow you to do it. You can test sensitivities. You'll know when people eat certain kinds of food, what happens to them. You can make connections. And this is where big data can be very, very valuable. But it can also be used as a means of classifying people, putting them in this, quote, other camp. And we see that going on today politically. Imagine if you had the ability to forecast how people would vote, and then, depending on that, try to manipulate the way that they're thinking.
Right. Mr. Furhan Hussain, about the accuracy of this data. Now, if so much investment is going into trying to collect it and trying to analyze it, is it always accurate?
The thing about accuracy is that there are many examples. Like I mentioned earlier, that the thing with small data is that it carries more nuance, whereas big data is more about collecting a specific piece of information about everyone. So that lacks nuance. As an example, in the past, when the war on terror was at its full swing, cell phone data, SIM registration data, people's citizenship data was all used to put together and identify people as potential terrorists. And then they were bombed using automatic algorithms at times. And we know that a lot of innocent lives were lost. Similarly, if insurance companies get hold of people's medical records, they can very well discriminate against healthy individuals with a certain family history. And there are a lot of concerns around that. But technology keeps improving. And as we have seen, algorithms have become more and more, they've improved with the passage of time, and the kind of information that is now being gathered and refined and is so sophisticated. However, our focus again should mostly remain around human rights and privacy in particular, which will always remain an ethical concern.
Right, and that point specifically, I want to pick up with Mr. Tangen as well. Now, governments all around the world would state that big data is being used to enhance and improve policy making specifically, and those were some of the benefits you mentioned in this. But is it only restricted to that? Are governments compromising on individual liberties, the right to privacy, and many other human rights to collect more and more data?
Well, I don't think there can be any real debate about that. I think the Snowden leaks and also the other leaks by just people in the U.S. have shown that there's a tremendous amount of illegal or unknown activity. In the U.S., we are by far the leader in this area. We don't get caught very often. It's not. We don't always get blamed for tapping into Merkel. That would not have been known except for leaked reports. So there are real concerns about this. But as I always tell people, I mean, that ship has sailed. You're not going to put the genie back in the bottle. And at this point, what we should be talking about is making people aware of the ethical issues, how far their governments should go. Hopefully, they will embrace some of it, at least on the surface. I do not believe that beneath the surface that they can resist from having this kind of ability to classify people and decide whether they like them or not. It's just they'll always justify it on the basis of security, of doing something for the greater good. I'm afraid that we should be just concentrating on what we can do, especially with these private companies who, in some aspects, are even a little bit more frightening than the governments themselves.
And expand upon that a little more. You're saying that some private companies, those that can come under state legislation, those that can be controlled, are in fact more powerful and are in fact pose a greater threat to all of this than the governments themselves.
Well, we had an attempt by Facebook, who has paid an enormous amount of fines and seems to have ethical lapses on a fairly regular basis. Sometimes a tin-eared, tone-deaf CEO and Mark Zuckerberg. They literally wanted to take over the financial system with their new kind of cyber coin. I thought it was interesting, the enormity of their ambition and the fact that they thought that they could assume this power, which is actually necessary for nations to have. It's controlling your currency's value is very, very important to an economy. I just couldn't believe that he really thought that this would just be handed over to him, and the ability and the power that would convey to a private entity, as I said, that isn't even bound by voters. They are just bound by their profit motive.
Right. Mr. Einar Tangen, just before I let you go, one last question that I do want to ask is the UN member states in 2015 came together, set a number of sustainable goals for 2030. When we talk about big data and technology in this regard, can it help us develop our economies in a more sustainable manner?
Yes, it can. I mean, the raw data can be produced, but remember, there are people in the world, Donald Trump among others, who will simply deny facts. They don't care. They say 99.999% of all scientists who understand this stuff believe one thing, but there's one guy who's sitting somewhere who doesn't or is skeptical of it, and we choose to believe him. So yes, we have the facts. This is the irony about the internet. We have it at our disposal at any given time through our phones, the ability to check facts and see what is true. Unfortunately, it has become the dissemination point of just pure opinions, Looney Tune ideas, denial, and that is unfortunate. It's the exact opposite of what many people envision the internet to be. Right.
On that point, thank you so much, Mr. Einar, for taking out the time and talking to us. Mr. Furhan Hussain, jumping back to you. Now, it's estimated, according to Gartner's research, that by 2020, almost 20.4 billion items will be connected to the internet. Now, we talk about the Internet of Things. Explain that concept to us a little, and how does that lead to the collection of data?
To simplify the concept of Internet of Things, this just means that devices will be are communicating with each other now, rather than being controlled or entirely communicating with human beings, where artificial intelligence has also played a very important role. And that can be a dangerous thing because as we automate things, we lose a lot of control. And it's very hard to identify when disasters happen.
Right. What do you mean by that exactly? It's hard to identify when disasters happen.
Well, we've seen that a lot of artificial intelligence algorithms and even robots have said some very scary things about how they plan to address certain problems around the world. There was I'm forgetting the name of that particular robot who was displayed with great pride around the world. And I believe she said something about how she would destroy humanity.
Right. That is a scary, and I want to come back to all this insidiousness that surrounds big data, its collection. But before that, I'd like to introduce Adam Smith, who's just joined us. He's the UK editor of PC Magazine, and he's also a social media expert. He joins us from London. Thank you so much, Adam, for joining us. Now, Adam, before you joined us, we were talking about how these big tech companies are even more powerful than some governments when it comes to the collection of data. What is their primary motive to collect this data, and how does this link to the collection of big data altogether?
Well, for a large company, the collection of data could be used for numerous things. Most people understand that companies like Facebook and Google collect their data in order to promote adverts. But other companies, such as insurance companies, can collect data in order to, say, have a better understanding of who is using their product and how to better sell their own products to them. For example, if you put out a lot of pictures of yourself running or of yourself Instagramming pictures of healthy meals, then a company analyzing that big data will be able to say, all right, this is more likely to be a healthy individual, and in the sense of, in regards to, say, an insurance premium, would be able to say they're less likely to need to be insured. We will offer them a certain price based on this information that we've gathered. I think big data is being used in a number of industries, and like the variety of what can be offered by using that data is.
Adam, stay with me. It's an important point you're making, that big data is being used by a variety of companies in a variety of manners. But something that you mentioned here is, of course, related to advertisement and how individuals specifically can be targeted after their likes and dislikes are being found. Mr. Furhan Hussain, when we're talking about this targeting and specific targeted advertisement, what are the dangers to this? I mean, most of us don't completely understand how it works, but when it does work, we're meh about it. We don't really care. How can it be damaging?
Well, for one, when we bring in human rights, it's damaging because it tramples upon a lot of fundamental human rights, because all of this data is being collected and sometimes with our consent, because we end up signing privacy, sort of like we say, I agree. But in most cases, people don't understand what's written over there. And so one could argue that it is partly without consent or without notice, and the way it's manipulated and used. So it seems like we might be coming full circle in terms of the human rights that we were able to get enforced for ourselves, because all of this becomes very gray area for big companies to manipulate.
Are governments and developers cognizant of this very fact, that the long progress that we've had to achieve certain human rights, enjoy certain human rights, are being slowly unraveled just because we want to continue to progress and develop our economies?
For sure. At least in most cases, they are aware of what is really happening. But then again, as Donald Trump's example was given earlier, it doesn't really matter if a huge amount of facts and scientific data is presented to certain individuals in power, because they're simply going to say no to it and go on following their own interests. Again, the idea of what's right and what's wrong is also determined by whoever is in power. So it's very important to keep close and keep enforced all the international standards that have been produced after years of working so hard and activism.
Right. Adam, when we're talking about who's in power, of course, it's important to talk about the monopolies of sorts that are these tech companies. It seems very difficult to control them, even though it seems like they're going in the right direction by saying we do want to be controlled more and more. But do you think that's being said earnestly?
I think this has been a debate that we've been having for a while, and it is always worth criticizing a tech company when they say they want regulation. Usually what that means is the tech company wants to have a hand in that regulation, and like many businesses, that is because if they have a part in that debate, they can use it to ensure that regulation benefits them much more than it benefits normal people. So yes, while I think it's important that we do regulate these companies and that we move forward doing that, it is worth always remembering that a relationship between government and big tech could always be harmful. As we've seen in the past in, say, the United States, we've had Amazon partnering with local governments with their Ring software, with their Ring products in order to essentially create surveillance. We've had Microsoft and Google building things for ICE, again, also in the United States. So these relationships are not always beneficial, even though it is only by government regulation that we can control these monopolies.
Right. And are there any standards, global, international standards? Now, Mr. Furhan Hussain mentioned this, that to set certain standards. Are there any that we can say that this works, this does need to be implemented, or are we just way off the mark? We haven't even developed those policies that can be implemented.
For sure, there are many standards that are in place. For starters, we can just go with what the UN has put in place regarding fundamental rights. The UN also has specific positions which are called the UN Special Rapporteurs, whose job is to work on particular rights and expand on them and sort of interpret them in various ways. So we have a lot of content that has been produced in forms of reports and principles by the UN Special Rapporteurs on freedom of expression and the Rapporteur on freedom of privacy. Apart from this, there are a lot of leading NGOs like Privacy International in the UK who have produced in collaboration with other organizations, some very important guidelines like the 13 principles on the application of privacy principles on mass surveillance, and so on and so forth.
Right. This all brings to mind how much of social media specifically, and I'll ask you this, how much of social media specifically is being used as a tool by states, nation states, to actually extend their surveillance. We heard about the Cambridge Analytica case in which Facebook was complicit. But how much of these social media platforms are colluding with governments?
I think it's very difficult to say when a social media platform is or is included in governments. I mean, every social media platform does its best to apply to the laws of the specific region that a user is using the software in, for example. So Facebook has different laws in, say, Germany than it does in the United Kingdom and shows content differently. The actual, I think, issue of collusion may be the wrong way to look at it. I think what is more important is actually how much information Analytica can be taken from these social media companies and then used to, say, target voters with, let's say, advertising or political messages in order to share information that is beneficial from whoever is originating those adverts. Whether or not the people at the higher up of, say, Facebook or TikTok or so on are actually collaborating with governments may actually not be as important as simply how much of this data can be analyzed and utilized by those that are in power.
Right. Mr. Hussain, let me just wrap up this segment and ask you this last question. Now, you mentioned awareness and consumer awareness specifically. Sometimes there are terms buried in the terms and conditions page. We just jump through them. Now, how can that awareness be increased? What real-time mechanisms do we have to do that?
I think there are a lot of good examples of how more progressive regions around the world have focused on building policies and guidelines to regulate big data collection and data retention. So GDPR is one such example. Similarly, there are a lot of commercial standards that are out there which can also be followed. In general, like there are certain accepted privacy principles, like how something is managed with regard to its accountability for its privacy policies and procedures, whether people are given a notice or not when their information is collected, used, retained, or disclosed, and whether their choice or consent is involved or not. Then again, how is that information used and retained and disposed? Who all has access to that information? How is that information being disclosed to third parties? Because then there are other interests involved as well. Then again, security for privacy is a concern. And then we can also talk about the quality of the kind of systems that are put in place. So who will monitor the monitor, essentially, and so on.
Right. And Mr. Furhan Hussain, you raised a number of important questions there. We're going to try to answer some of those in our next segment, but thank you so much for joining us, Mr. Furhan Hussain from Karachi and Adam Smith from London. We're going to go for a short break. When we return, we're going to continue our discussion. Stay with us. Welcome back to the show. While we continue talking about big tech and how it's going to shape the future. Joining us now is Professor Lyal Sunga, who's a visiting professor at Raoul Wallenberg Institute of Human Rights and Humanitarian Law. Also joining us is Mr. Gilbert VanKerckhove, who is the author of Toxic Capitalism and is an economist, joining us from Beijing. Thank you both for joining us and welcome to the show. Professor Sunga, now, in the earlier segment, we talked about what exactly big data is, how it's being used, but it does raise a lot of fundamental questions about how it's being misused and specifically violating human rights. What do you see the state of big data today in terms of human rights and how it's misusing them?
It's a double-edged sword very much, because we have the situation where on the one hand, the right to information and the right to express your opinions and to disseminate them are vastly improved and expedited and facilitated through computer technology, and including big data. Big data is very good for example, tracking infectious diseases and protecting the right to health. For example, the Ebola virus, tracking the animal carriers of that, it's a big difficult task, but with big data approaches that can be done much more effectively. Similarly, protecting the environment, tracking climate change, these are all big data issues which we can do much more efficiently with those that capacity. The difficulty is when it's used for tracking human behavior. There's an obvious issue of right to privacy. And also, on the other side, freedom of opinion and to shape your views without interference of being manipulated. We've seen, for example, certain social media, Facebook and WhatsApp, and where information is being gathered, so that the individuals are profiled, and then you're bombarded with messages and very influential type of information that manipulates your views. This was the big issue with Cambridge Analytica.
Professor Sunga, this is one question that I do like to bring up, especially when we're talking about Cambridge Analytica, how much it swung the voter base. Now, as you mentioned, it has real influence on opinion, but do we assume in all of this that the end user is completely passive?
No, I wouldn't say that the end user is completely passive, because we're all participating in social media and the use of technology and information technology. The difficulty is that once a person turns over their information, they don't know how it's being used. And so there have to be coherent principles to guard against the misuse of your information and its resale and onward conveyance for nefarious purposes. Right. And that's one of the big risks. And there have been quite a lot of initiatives now to try to curb that potential for abuse.
Right. Professor Sunga, stay with me. I want to jump to Mr. Gilbert and talk to him about all of this. Now, I mentioned just before the start of the segment that we will be talking about how big tech will shape the future, and especially when we're talking about the future of politics. How do you see this impact of big data on it?
Well, the impact of big data is something really becoming extremely, extremely big. Professor Lyal already pointed out many of the main issues that also are my own concern. We cannot stop the trend. Big data has become really something very, very important. And when you use it together with artificial intelligence, you see also very strong computing skills that go up, the power of computing. It is something that is being used, as said the professor, already in many, many fields. It can be technical, it can be warehousing, it can be consumer trends, any trends you want to check, be it in fashion, in tourism, or whatever. So this is for sure unstoppable. The big issue that everybody is working on today is the issue of privacy and the protection of personal rights and also personal privacy. In particular, we have to think about protecting, for example, children and other people. So these are big, big issues today, but how can we formulate the laws and regulation? This is something that no any country today is really able to handle carefully. But it is for sure needed that we, as victims, if I may say so, we are aware that how our data are being used and if they are kept in a certain way that we can be identified. These are all the things today being looked at.
Right. Mr. Gilbert, from everything you stated here, I want to pick up on the consumer trends that you mentioned. Now, when we talk about the realm of trade and international relations, why is big data becoming indispensable specifically for trade?
Well, I think trade is just like fashion, like a consumer. It is a trend that people want to study, to see in which direction things are going. So it's like a research a tool. Now, the big issue is, of course, if it is badly used, wrongly used by authoritarian governments, if it is used for political purposes, then it is becoming a kind of a nightmare. Obviously, people want to see, for example, if we see now the whole issue of impeachment that is going on in the US, there are also people want to study what's the trend, what's the feeling of the people towards this process.
Now we're joined by Ms. Nighat Dad, who's a Pakistani lawyer and internet activist who runs the not-for-profit organization Digital Rights Foundation. She joins us from Lahore. Thank you so much, Ms. Dad, for joining us and welcome to the show. Now, we've been talking a lot about how big data and wanting to collect more and more of it is, of course, an invasion of privacy. In all of this, is the citizen and individual rendered completely helpless?
Yeah, so the kind of trend that we are seeing that big data is actually an opportunity for not only for the companies, tech giants, but also for governments. And what we have seen that from governments to companies and tech giants has been calling data as a new oil, and it's not only it's helping the companies like IBM or Amazon for for new innovation and technologies and by knowing their customers, but also like if we sort of look into the governments, how they are using big data for their governance, but also, like for instance, like a very basic thing is like controlling crimes and stuff. And we kind of see use of big data in initiatives like, for instance, like safe cities or smart cities or safe campuses where, the government try to gather data to sort of see the trends in the city and try to make it safer for the citizens. But in this whole effort, I think one thing that is very dangerous and troubling, especially for the countries who are collecting mass amount of data, but are weaker in rule of law and have no policies or standard operating procedures or laws which sort of talks about or protect citizens' data or data protection. And I think that's where the problem starts. So when we see that there are like new innovations or digitalization or collection of data and big data is playing massive role in developed countries, we also see that, like the rule of law is also, it goes hand in hand, so that they're like very strong data protection regime in Europe, for instance. So we call it GDPR. But what we have seen in our part of the world is that we are seeing the different efforts of collecting data. For instance, like we have like massive biometric database. It's the world's largest biometric database. But how many of us as citizens know that how NADRA collects citizens' data, how they secure our data, who has access to it, and how they sort of destruct that data? Because like when you have a legislation or a law or a standard operating procedure, that sort of tells you and the authority or the public body or the private body that how they are going to regulate this data, which is sort of lacking in Pakistan and also in lots of other developing countries at the moment.
Ms. Dad, as you are talking about the legislation, the law-making side of it, I do want to understand how much more goes into data protection other than just implementing laws. Of course, that being an indispensable part of it, but what other aspects contribute to data protection?
I think when we talk about data protection law, it's not just the discussion around this one particular law. I mean, Pakistan is also like I'm also being very cautious while talking about the legislation and how we need like a sort of regulation or legal regime around data protection, because what we have seen in the past is that the laws that were made in the name of controlling cyber crimes or looking into the cyber violence or harassment, the same law has also been misused against citizens or internet users. So I think there are several aspects to it that not only demanding a good law, but also like the contribution of stakeholders who are relevant. So your tech industry, your businesses, but also like civil society organizations or digital rights people, but at the same time internet users, like people in my country. You would know that not many people are aware that what exactly is the privacy right when the right is not even respected in our culture. So when when it comes to online spaces or data, people are absolutely unaware, and there is absolutely no acknowledgement of their own rights.
On all of this, you're making a very essential point, and I put this question earlier as well. When we're talking about the end user, the consumer, how much of the onus lies on them to be aware and use their data carefully?
So, like as an activist and privacy advocate, I feel that we shouldn't put a lot of onus on the internet user or the consumer, because it's the companies, it's the government, it's the people who are collecting all this data is actually benefiting out of that data, right? So, we are actually the product. And but at the same time, I think we also have not many options to hold companies or the public bodies accountable, because we do not have like a proper regime and also lack of awareness, and we do not consider that it's actually a violation of our privacy rights. So I think the more you know about your rights in the online space and also about your data, I think the more you can prevent the breach of your data. Again, it's very unfortunate scenario where we kind of end up putting an onus and burden on the consumer, and it shouldn't be an ideal scenario. It's actually like for instance, the telecom companies, social media companies, tech giants, like projects like Safe Cities, their responsibility to, first of all, to take measures on their own, but at the same time aware citizens that how they are collecting their
data. And how can this awareness, how can we spread this awareness? What are some of the key points? And I do want to put this last question to you. There was a lot of talk about privacy and consent. Individuals not even having the right or being able to exercise their consent while their privacy is being invaded. If you have to give recommendations for policies in order to ensure that people are willingly and conscious that they're giving their consent, what would those be?
So I think there are like several aspects to it. I feel that first of all, it's our state's responsibility to take care of the citizens' data they collect as a state and different public bodies of the state. At the same time, holding companies, telecom companies, and also tech giants accountable to respect the privacy of their consumers. Because, like for instance, if I'm a Facebook user in Pakistan, I do not have so many legal rights to hold the company accountable,
right,
as compared to the U.S. citizen, right? So I think it's important that not only the state recognize its role and also recognize that right to privacy in the online space should be equal as they treat, other fundamental rights in the offline space.
Right.
At the same time, the companies should also take proactive measures instead of, we as internet users holding them accountable.
Right. And that is one of the points we always come back to, how these tech companies need to be proactive in preventing breaches of privacy and preventing data leaks. But it seems like since their business model is still up and running, that doesn't seem to be happening in the near future. But we'll have to wait and find out. On that point, thank you so much, Ms. Nighat Dad, for joining us from Lahore, Professor Lyal S. Sunga for joining us from Rome, and Mr. Gilbert VanKerckhove for joining us from Beijing. Thank you for watching Indus Special. We will see you again tomorrow with more stories. Till then, goodbye and take care.